Well, good evening, and thank you for waiting. Welcome to another lecture in the series Perspectives on Economic Liberty, hosted by the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty here at Arizona State University. The Perspectives lecture series emerges from the center's mission, which is to contribute to academic research and public discussion of the contribution of economic liberty and free enterprise to advancing human betterment. One of the ways we fulfill that mission is to invite a variety of guests who examine our purpose by revisiting past debates over the role of economic liberty in human betterment, evaluate economic liberty's contribution to human betterment for good and ill, and consider its relation to other human values and freedoms that we may hold. I'd also like to acknowledge now the co-sponsorship of tonight's event by the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at ASU. Today, our guest is Steve Horwitz, University Distinguished Professor of Economics at Ball State University. I've known Steve since our grad school days, although we went to different universities. He went to George Mason. Because of our common interest in the history of economic thought and the ongoing legacy of past economists in our thinking about contemporary economic issues. I'm happy to say that Steve and I are on much more friendly terms than our respective heroes, F.A. Hayek and Frank Knight. Steve has become well known for his public commentary on issues ranging from monetary economics. Look, for example, for his open letter to my friends on the left, written during the crisis, the financial crisis, to price gouging during hurricanes and other natural disasters. Again, you can search for his TV commentary on Hurricane Dorian and earlier hurricanes. 4 years ago, Steve published a book called Hayek's Modern Family. You can see his allegiances still run deep. Classical Liberalism and the Evolution of Social Institutions. I'm assuming some part of tonight's lecture will make use of those ideas. And please join me in welcoming Steve Horwitz to Arizona State University.
Well, thank you, Ross, and thank you all for coming this evening. Before I start, two things. First, I wanted our friend, Vernon Smith, who is 91, 92 years old, Nobel Prize winner, is known to start public lectures, and he's still out lecturing all the time, start lectures these days by saying, I'm very happy to be here. In fact, I'm very happy to be anywhere these days. And I share Vernon's thought. I also want to take a moment to thank Ross and the staff of the center and all the folks who've been involved the last 2 days in my talk today and Sarah's talk yesterday. It has been a pleasure to be out here. You guys run a great ship, and this has been fun and easy and most enjoyable. So thank you very much for having us and for doing so well by us. So with that out of the way, see if my clicker is working, and it is. This is my sort of full, long, descriptive title, and I'm going to try to talk about all of these things today. As Ross said, this is based on the book, and it sort of is mostly the first half of the book combined with a little bit of stuff later in the book. And so let me start, as I like to, by sort of laying out the pieces of the argument I want to present. Okay, I want to start by talking about what Hayek called the fact that we live in two sorts of worlds at once, the worlds of the intimate and the anonymous, and I'll explain what that means in a few moments. And then I'm going to use that as a way to sort of launch into talking about the family. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that prior to the advent of capitalism, the family was not an especially nice place, and particularly for women and for children, less so for males, for the husband and father, but certainly for most of the rest of the family, not the best place. And what we know and love now as the modern family is a product of capitalism. And I'm going to sort of pause right there and say that's an overstatement. It is significantly, largely a product of capitalism. And one of the things I'll start by saying is I'm going to make a very strong claim today, and places I'll sort of attenuate it. But the strong claim is that capitalism and the emergence of capitalism played a crucial role in the evolution of the family in ways that we I think would find desirable. And this is an important point that's going to run under much of what I talk about this afternoon, which is that the mutual freedom of markets and social life is a particular feature of liberalism, classical liberalism, as we know it. And one of the claims I want to make is that when you give people economic freedom, you're going to give them the freedom to to engage in all kinds of social arrangements that you might or might not like, and that the relationship between those two is very tight. And you can't say the idea that somehow you can give people economic freedom but limit the kinds of social arrangements they can make, I think is a fantasy. I don't think you can do that. I'm going to talk a lot more about that as I go along. So one of the things to think about as I'm talking is, what's that relationship between economic freedom, markets, capitalism, and sort of the sort of social freedoms to form families in all kinds of various ways. And finally, I want to come back to this two worlds question and sort of think about how we navigate this in the world of the 21st century. So let me say a few words about this distinction between the intimate and anonymous orders. What we mean by intimate orders are things like our families, our friends, our workplaces, right? You can think about our long evolutionary past in this way. For most of human history in the long view, this is the way we existed. We existed in small bands of people who we knew face to face, right? We had intimate relationships with them in the sense of we knew who they were, we knew what they liked, we knew what they didn't like. We existed in groups in which we agreed on the ends, in which people behaved altruistically. Those were largely, though not completely, collectivistic. So again, the family is a good example of this, but you can think about things like tribes and kin, larger groups than the narrow family. And in fact, the family as we think about it today, the sort of nuclear family, didn't really exist in this sense, in the sense that we think about it now. And so we have, as human beings, for most of our sort of biological history, existed. This is the world we existed in, okay? And this is the world we know. And Hayek says at one point, this is the world that conditions our moral instincts. This is why we are inclined to be altruistic and collectivistic, and why we get all hyped up about things like war, right? Where we perceive ourselves as all on the same team. By contrast, we can talk about the anonymous world of the market, or the great society, what Adam Smith called the commercial society, right? This is the world we have lived in for perhaps the last 200 years or so, okay? And the difference is, in this world, we all have diverse ends. We're all pursuing our own projects, as Sarah quoted our friend Lauren Lemaski yesterday afternoon. We are broadly self-interested, and we are individualistic in this way, right? That we primarily see ourselves as individuals, not as members of these groups. This is, as I suggested, a relatively recent phenomenon. We're talking maybe hundreds of years at the most. And one way to think about what capitalism and liberalism and sort of the changes we saw in the 18th century and 19th century did was to turn what was a largely intimate society into one which those intimate orders are integrated into a larger anonymous one. So think about the world we live in today. We exist in families and workplaces and all these other intimate groupings, but they're all constantly banging against each other and sort of existing in this larger anonymous world. When we go to buy things at the store, we're buying from people we don't know, right? When we go to engage in all kinds of commercial transactions, when the internet has changed our lives in this way too. It's sort of extended the anonymous world in all kinds of ways. And so we're constantly sort of moving back and forth between these two worlds. And the quote from Hayek that sort of sets the stage in the book and for this whole idea you can see here. We have to learn to live simultaneously within different kinds of orders according to different kinds of rules. That how we operate within a family or within a workplace or how we behave towards our friends is going to be different than the ways in which we behave towards anonymous others. And if you want an example of that, right, just think about why it is that we feel a little awkward and wronged when an intimate friend or family member gives us cash for our birthday, or give your wife cash for her anniversary. Try that sometime, okay? There's something not right about that, because cash is a reflection of that anonymous order in a way that we expect within the intimate order of the family and friends to behave differently. So the one question that, again, underlying this whole talk to think about is how do we learn to live in and navigate between these different kinds of orders that operate by very different rules, yet are all essential to modernity. And one of the things I'll sort of warn from the beginning here is do not take this talk as a kind of anti-family talk. I love families, right? I'm very pro-family, okay? But it is a difficult question sometimes to think about. How do we learn the rules that apply within the intimate order of the family, and then also learn that those aren't the same rules that apply outside. And you can think about the times and sort of calls over history for brotherhood of man, right, sort of comrade, and all these kinds of things that have been attempts to extend the morality and the structure of the family to society as a whole. I mean, that's one way of thinking about what socialism and related movements have done. And we know, for a variety of reasons, that it can't work, right? But nonetheless, it's not a wrong description of how we operate within things like families. And so moving back and forth between those two is an interesting challenge. So with that in mind, let's sort of turn to the history here. And I want to talk about the evolution from what we might call the pre-modern to the modern family, okay? So I'm going to go backwards a little bit. Let's talk about what we might mean by the modern family. There's a possible modern family. Talking dogs are normally not, but we'll let it go. So one of the features of the modern family is that marriage is by choice and by love. And/or by love. And notice those two things are distinct. We frequently run them together, right? We talk about arranged marriages, okay? But you can have a marriage by consent that's not necessarily a marriage about love. People might marry each other by consent for different reasons, for reasons other than what we think of now as romantic love. And we have all kinds of examples from sort of literature and the movies and so on, right, about this. My favorite might be Fiddler on the Roof, where she says, do you love him? And she says, I learned to love him, right, after 25 years, right? And so that's, right, we think back to marriages, and I'm going to talk more about that, where consent, these are not arranged marriages, but the reason people married was not romantic love as we think about it today. The modern family we think of as sort of nuclear, private, and insulated. We think about the sort of family living in a house together. We tend not to think about extended family members. We tend not to think about having sort of boarders in living in the house or other kinds of help necessarily living in the house. We think of the family as private, right? We think of it as sort of walled off from the public worlds of politics and other kinds of things. Children are sentimentalized, and childhood is sheltered. If there's parents in the room, I probably don't have to say too much more about that, but certainly one of the interesting features, particularly of, say, the last 20 or 30 years, is the increased sentimentalization of children. You're driving your car and you see the baby on board sticker right on it, right? And like, so be careful, there's a child here. And sort of the other example, anyone watches The Simpsons, right? If you remember, Mrs. Reverend Lovejoy's wife every time would pop up and say, what about the children? Every time they proposed something. So we have turned childhood into this very sort of sentimental and sheltered, right? I like to say to students, right? You spend the first 18, 22 years of your life sort of in this bubble, right, of education and these other kinds of things. And we think back to times in which, young people would strike out, leave the household and strike out at age 11 or 12 or 13, right? But childhood, very different today. So that's a feature of the modern family. And finally, equality of the sexes and the financial independence of women, which is certainly part of the story, and one of the things I'll talk about is why we see a rising divorce rate over the course of the 20th century. And certainly that's part of it. And one of the features of the modern family is, in fact, more frequent divorce. And we'll talk, again, a little bit more about that as we go along. So that's the modern family. The question is, all right, this is the one we know. What were families like before this? So the pre-modern family. The first thing to understand is that for most of human history, the family was not just an economic institution, but the fundamental economic institution. One way to think about this was that the household was the unit of production. For the sort of econ folks in the audience, the household was a firm, right? That's, I think, the best way to think about it. That the household was responsible for economic production, and that family members, the role of family members was sort of like employees contributing to this production. And this whole process, of course, was under this dad, husband, father, CEO, right? Sort of making sure that all of this happened in the ways that it was supposed to. And for, again, most of human history, economic production took place in the family. This was mostly agricultural, but we can also think about things like small crafts and so forth. But it's easiest to think about the sort of farm family as being the best example of this phenomenon, where all of the members of the family either work the field or help raise kids and so on. So that's an important feature of the pre-modern family. There is a way that we know that families for most of human history were connected up with the work that people do. We have a little remnant of that, a vestige of that today. Anyone know what I'm thinking of? Last names, excellent. Right, there's probably some examples in the room, so I don't know everybody's names. But think about names like Baker, right? Or anything with a Smith in it, right? Cooper, anyone know what Coopers did? No, not shoes. Barrels, right? Fletchers, anyone know what Fletchers did? Arrows, excellent, right. So all of these names, right, are reflections, right? You were John the Smith, okay, and so forth. So we still see that today as some evidence, right, of that phenomenon. The other thing to remember about the pre-modern family is that people were poor. Everybody was poor, right, with a very few exceptions. Right? Everybody was poor, and people lived at the margins. And so decisions about family, about who to marry, about how many kids to have, about all the things we think of as family decisions today had to be understood in the context of that poverty, right, of people making decisions in extreme poverty. I do want to note, too, though, that the family was also a political institution. A couple things to point out here. Certainly among the rich, right, families were contestations for political power. We think about dynasties, we think about kingships, we think about all of these sorts of things where family was about political power. And we certainly have plenty of examples from literature and art and so forth about the way in which family drama was connected up with political drama. One of my favorite footnotes in the book is a footnote for those of you who've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You might remember the famous wedding scene between Princess Luki and the king of Swamp Castle's son or daughter, not clear. And they are about to get married, and sort of, then he refers to at one point the marriage of these two people, right? And so there's this notion, right, that this was an economic arrangement. And even when Sir Galahad comes through and leaves everybody bloody all over the floor, right? What do they say? Oh, well, the wedding has to go on. Right, because this is too important, right? The politics of this is too important. But for poor folks, right, it's important to remember that it was a political function for poor folks too. Families expanded networks of cooperation and community for the poor. One of the things about getting married is suddenly you have this whole other group of people who care about you and your children. Right? Grandchildren are awesome because you got these two giant sort of branches of people who care about them. Right? And so one of the things that marriage did if you were poor was to bring people into your social network in ways that both brought resources but also enabled you to fend off invaders and all kinds of things like that. So as much as the family, I think, predominantly was an economic institution, it's important to not forget that it had this political role as well. So what else might we say about our pre-modern family? A couple of other contrasts. First one, as I sort of hinted at, marriage for a while was arranged very often, and still in some places in the world we still see arranged marriages. But even if it was chosen, it was not about, for the most part, what we think of today as romantic love. If you think about a world in which you are desperately poor, and in which agriculture for most people was the way that they had to earn a living, your decision about who to marry was an economic decision in the sense of, can we produce together, right? And so for the economists, right, one way to think about this is that if you think about marriage as being a combination of human capital, right, we want people to have human capital that mesh, that are complementary, that can form together. For most of human history, that human capital was about productivity, right? Production. Can we produce together? Can we run a farm together, right? And perhaps just as important, can she bear children, right? So today we might look at a potential marriage partner and say, he or she's beautiful, or he or she's interesting. But back then it was, look at those shoulders and look at those hips, right? She can push a plow. Right? And she is more likely to bear children. You need it for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, right? You needed to have children. So even if marriage was chosen, right? Even if marriage was chosen, it wasn't necessarily about love. And in fact, when we look at the sort of literature of going back hundreds of years ago, romantic love was not about your spouse, it was about the other person, right? And it was something you did outside of marriage was romantic love. For most people, marrying for romantic love, as we think about it today, was a very dangerous choice because, remember, living at the margins, if you made a mistake and couldn't produce together, you had a big problem. It was a luxury that people could not afford at the time unless, again, you were sufficiently economically secure to do that. And so for most people, it was not about romantic love. Another great movie about this, by the way, of course, is My Big Fat Greek Wedding, right? If you know the movie, the contrast between the family's perception of who she should marry, right, and the fact that she's marrying Ian Miller, right, it sort of reflects, and she's marrying for love, not a sensible Greek, young Greek man. And there's that great scene where the main character is talking to her mom, Telena Kazan, and she says, and she's sort of saying about how much she loves him, and the mom says, "Oh, Tula, eat something." Right, like this is silliness. Okay, to think you should marry for love is silliness. Again, that takes place in a more modern sort of context, but the contrast is the one that I think we're really getting at. Women, of course, were almost, and in fact, in some cases, property. If you don't know what the coverture laws are, you should. The coverture comes from the claim that married women were covered by their husbands. And what was meant by that was that married women were unable to make their own economic decisions. They were husbands, it was as if they were one unit, and it was the husband who was the decision maker. And coverture laws that limited what married women could do economically in terms of contracts and property and so on. There's all kinds of interesting stories about how married women try to get around them through all kinds of clever ways, as you might expect. And it's worth noting that these, in the United States anyways, these didn't really all, they were state by state, didn't all disappear until late in the 19th century, right, into the 1870s and 1880s. And there were still some remnants of it later on, right, where some states still prevented women from sort of getting their own credit without their husband's approval and things like that. This was really, and even if you think about marital rape laws, some of this stuff lingered on into my own, I was born in '64, into my own lifetime, right? So this is not, this was the constant back then, but still even more recently part of our world. Children, of course, were economic assets. There's a lot of ways of thinking about this. I think the most important was that they were labor on a farm, and that they were also old age support, right? The more kids you had, the more likely it would be that if you got old and could not take care of yourself, you would have someone who could care for you. And of course, if you were running a farm, you needed workers on the farm. As I like to say, creating your own workers on the farm is a lot cheaper and a lot more fun than hiring people. Okay, so for someone got it, right? So for these families, right, having a large number of children was particularly important. Of course, one of the problems here is that for women, this meant sort of spending their whole lives either pregnant or nursing or both, right? And also multiple pregnancies to generate the sort of needed number of children and the dangers of dying in childbirth. All of this was horrifically dangerous for women. And we think today about single-parent families and the problems with them. Single-parent families are not a new thing. Many single-parent families historically came because women died during childbirth. And also, by the way, because men died at work. That was another way that we saw that. And it's important to remember here, too, that this is a world until the early 20th century in which children, the likelihood of a child surviving to adulthood was essentially 50-50 at birth. And so for parents, one of the pieces of evidence we have of that is we find families with children, with multiple children with the same name, like two kids named John. One reason being that parents wanted to make sure there was one, so they often named two or three with the same name to ensure that one would survive. Okay, and we forget this world in which the death of children was a constant. And one of the things this means is that in some sense, families at the time were less able to afford, and I put it in quotes, too much sentimentality about children. It wasn't just that they didn't love their kids, right? But the reality of the world was that they knew some number of those kids would not make it to adulthood. They also knew that they didn't have literally the resources to sort of keep kids alive and sort of shower them with the kind of attention we have today. And so in that sense, right, it wasn't that they didn't care, but economists, again, might think of it this way, right? Their preferences might have been like ours, but the constraints they were under were much tighter, right? That they simply couldn't exercise that love and that caring and that sentimentality in the way that we do today. It's also worth noting that historically, families were much more public institutions. People were in your business, okay? the church, the state, to the extent we could disentangle those for parts of human history, and even the sort of community, all regulated and intervened in the family. If you didn't marry the right person in a small community, you heard about it from other people, because the fact that you might not be marrying someone who you can produce with meant that you were threatening the economic stability and security of that community. And so other people's investment in your marriage and in your faithfulness, you can think about things like the Scarlet Letter and so on, right, were a feature of these societies. With all that said, let's talk about one thing that hasn't changed, right? Again, the family was then and remains, I think, an indispensable transmitter of cultural values and norms. So again, don't hear me wrong, right? I don't think we can't get by without something like the family. And this sort of very depressing picture I've painted here, right? Part of the sort of good part of the story is that this changes and we get out of this world. Just a quick story, when I started writing this book, I spent 10 weeks out at Bowling Green State University on a sort of visiting fellowship there. And there was a couple days I spent reading these histories of the family from the 17th and 18th century. And it was like the worst, it was, I won't repeat stuff that happened that I read about, but it was horrible. I mean, it was just horrible. And I literally had trouble sleeping right after spending 2 full days reading about this. And so one of the things I hope to get across in this talk is that how much better things are today. So just as one piece of evidence of this, I don't know how well you can see this in the back. Oh, it's actually pretty good. This is from a sort of cemetery in the New Orleans area. These are all members of the Claverie family. And I don't know how well you can see, but when they died, 2 years, 6 months, 7 years, 10 months, 11 days, 5 years, 2 days, 15 months, 2 years, 6 years. So this is one I'm not sure why my nuttall's in there, but 1, 2, 3, so it's 7 or 8 kids, all of whom died in early childhood. Okay, and so this is the world in which human beings existed for centuries, really. So what caused the change? You know what my answer is, because it's in the title of my talk. But sort of how? What did capitalism, what did these economic changes do to change the way that families were structured? And the way that families and the sort of the quality of life within families. And I think that there's 2 key things I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about wage labor and then the increase in wealth. So let me first talk about wage labor, and this is the Marxist portion of the talk. One of the things that begins to happen with the advent of capitalism is we get the factory system. And factories hire non-family. For the first time in human history, we have a significant number of people who are working and earning a living outside of the context of their family. We use the phrase "go to work," right, and come home from work, right? In the old beer commercial, right? It's Miller time. You're home from work, right? So that notion of going to work is relatively new. It brought on by the structural changes that come with free enterprise, with the accumulation of capital and the advent of the factory system. And so men, and we'll talk a little bit about women and children in a moment too, but certainly men begin to go outside of the home to earn a living. And suddenly the nature of the family and the household change. The family will begin to lose its identity as an economic institution when market incomes can be earned outside of the context of the family. And we see, again, this separation of home and work, which is going to be fundamental to other kinds of transformations. Now, again, it's not like there weren't people working for wages before this, but the factory system in particular upped the ante here and sort of expanded the number of people for whom work took place outside of the household. Right? And today, when we think about households today, we don't think about them, at least in the sort of developed world, as being sites of production in this way. The other piece of the puzzle is, relatedly, is that wages and wealth rise. The ability of people to work with better capital in a factory causes an increase in their wages. Certainly over the work they might have been doing on the farm. We see early on in the Industrial Revolution, of course, women and children working as well in the factories. Again, one of the reasons being is that was often the difference between survival and non-survival, the wages that you earn from wives and or children working in the factory. But over time, right, as wages rise and wealth rises, the women come home from the factories, the kids come out of the factories, as those that income is no longer needed. And you can see how that's going to affect the way we think about family. And one of the most important things that happens here is that family size shrinks. One of the most clear and obvious empirical facts in the social sciences is that when people get wealthier, they have fewer kids. They just do, for a whole bunch of different reasons, and there's all kinds of explanatory factors to this. But certainly one of them is that you now don't need to think about children as assets anymore. You're off the farm. You don't need to think about them in that way. You're making a better living. You're less perhaps concerned about old age support, okay? And you have resources to invest in your children. We were talking about Gary Becker in class this morning, right? This is the Becker story where we end up choosing quality over quantity. Parents begin to have the ability to invest in their kids, particularly when women and children return to the home from factories. Now kids are at home. What are you going to do with them, right? You're going to invest in their human capital by getting them educated, by giving them opportunities to get skills and so on. And if once you do that, you realize, hey, look, I can't afford necessarily to have as many kids as I might have otherwise. And notice, right, how this plays into discussions about birth control and so forth. I like to tell my students, believe it or not, there was birth control 100 years ago, right? 200 years ago. What didn't always work very well, but it existed, okay? And people knew how to control their fertility if they wanted to. And we think today about parts of the world where, and there's very few left now, where sort of population, still have large families and population growth in these ways. And the temptation of us in the West is to send them condoms, right, and say, don't have as many kids, and then we go back 2 years later and find the condoms are all balloons hanging in the trees because they didn't use them. Why not? They don't want fewer kids, right? They need the kids that they have, and what's going to lead them to have fewer kids is the economic development that changes this calculation. The other thing, of course, that begins to happen is that marriage becomes increasingly about love. As we have outsourced, as it were, economic production to factories and to other kinds of places, thinking about the household as being this productive unit and thinking about marital matches as being about, she has great shoulders and whatever, right? The sort of the complementarity of their productive human capital. Now, more and more people can slowly afford to make marriage become about love because the economic constraints that made that difficult, okay, have loosened thanks to these changes. And one way to see this is when we think about sort of romantic attraction today, it's not about the other person's productivity and their sort of human capital with respect to production. It's about their human capital with respect to consumption. Why do you enjoy spending time with her? Well, we like to read the same books, right? We both like to travel. We both like to eat out. We both like to ski, whatever it might be, right? Those complementarities in consumption are what drive relationships today, right? And again, we can afford to do that because we don't have to worry about the family being the source of our economic well-being. And then childhood changes in the ways that sort of we've suggested here. Childhood becomes this more sheltered place where we're educating kids, we're shielding them from the public world until we think that they're ready for that. We sentimentalize it. Now we have the ability to care for kids, and those constraints have loosened as well. Kids get education again in ways that they did not before. All of that sort of gauzy Victorian, family stuff that we think about begins to emerge here because we can afford it, right? We can afford to do that in ways that we could not before. And the family again becomes increasingly private. The state, the church, and the community all become restrained, both by the law, right, but also by sort of the notion. Once we kind of get these things going, right, suddenly the things that the family does and the functions that the family performs become about these emotional and psychological kinds of things that make it feel like it's more about the couple and the family, and the stakes are lower for the rest of the community. Pretty much, it's again, unusual for people to say, you're marrying the wrong person, and somehow if you marry him or her, you're going to be, you're going to threaten the economic security of our of our community. We just don't hear that anymore, except in places in the world that are still have not sort of caught up economically. So this notion that other people have a significant investment in your marital choices has receded. And part of that, of course, is democracy, liberalism, and all of these other kinds of things are important here too. And again, as I said, I'm making a sort of overstated case about the importance of the economic factors, but I don't want to leave this out, right? When we begin to recognize individuals as having rights and as individuals, when we begin to think about the ways in which we want to devolve power away from kings and queens towards the people, all of these fit in nicely, and certainly liberalism in the broad sense of recognizing, again, the rights of individuals and so on becomes part of this too. And you can see these family changes as being part of that broader story. And in particular, right, one of the things that capitalism did was to change the role of women. There's a whole chapter in the book on sort of women in the 20th century and the changes that happened, and I'm going to try to summarize that here, but I find this topic, I teach a whole course on the economics of gender, which is just a fun, really fun course to teach, and we talk a lot about these things. So this is from the 30s or 40s. These are women working, believe it or not. Women worked before the 1970s. For those of you who don't know what those are adding machines. And what's great, there's a number of great things about this picture, right? The best part is these jobs don't exist anymore, right? Adding machine, right? Or better yet, right? These are all done by computers. But nonetheless, right? These were the jobs that women had in this period, and they had them. Okay, and so the interesting question is, what do we know about the growth in female labor force participation, about the increased number of women who were working? Let me first say there's a belief out there, particularly among conservatives, and the story, it's a hockey stick kind of story, and it goes something like this. It's this sort of, well, here's the 20th century. Women didn't work, women didn't work, women didn't work. Feminism, boom, women suddenly started working, right? Along comes the late 1960s and early 70s, boom, women start working. There's a little bit of truth to that I want to talk about, but the real story looks more like this. Women are working more, women are working more, women are working more, 60s, 70s come along, they're working, my economist friends, the second derivative changes. Well, women start working a little bit more, right? But the change is not this sort of fundamental right? There's not a moment in which suddenly women start working, right? We have shows like Mad Men, right, that show us women working in the sort of 40s and 50s and so on, and note how unpleasant it was for women. I'm going to come back to that point in just a minute. So women have worked throughout the 20th century, by the way, particularly African-American women, which is a story we don't talk about a lot. Their labor force participation rates historically were much greater than those of white women. They get swamped in the overall data by the fact that they are fewer in number. Why do women start working? A couple reasons. One, the economy grows, the demand for labor grows. We need more workers, right? We need people to fill jobs, and we also see, in particular, we see the sort of clerical and service jobs in which, compared to the sort of physicality of industrial production, men and women are a much more equal playing field. In addition, women have greater human capital. Women are going to school, they're getting educated, and so that means that the wages that they were both being offered and could command were growing, and the sort of the opportunity cost of staying home became higher. More women entered the labor force. In addition, of course, households still have to be taken care of. Household production still has to happen. And we see in the 20th century a decline in the time needed to engage in household production at home, thanks significantly to household technology. If you've never seen The Magic Washing Machine by Hans Rosling's TED Talk, your homework assignment, don't do it now, your homework assignment is to go Google The Magic Washing Machine and watch it, and sort of get a sense of the importance of this household technology. But even things like the carpet sweepers and vacuum cleaners, all these sorts of technology that came into the home in the 20s and 30s may reduce the amount of time necessary to be, for someone, women for the most part, to be in the home. And as we move along later, right, we get microwave ovens and all the rest. And so that becomes important. And there's another factor that is here that means women could spend less time in the home. Anyone? We talked about it earlier. Probably the most important reason women could spend less time in the home. Fewer kids, yeah, fewer kids, right? So if you're having fewer kids and you're, sort of getting better maybe at spacing them out in the ways that you want, right? That also mattered here too. And also, rising wealth means that we have market alternatives to household labor. I have a great crowd for this question. If you are 45 years or old or older, I would like you to answer the following question. When you were in, say, junior high and high school, how many times per month did you either eat out or bring food in? Right? Right, 0, maybe 1, maybe 2. I'm old enough to be in that group, right? And yeah, not very often. Okay, anyone here who's under the age of 25, right? How often in the last 5 or 10 years of your life, right, did you go out for dinner or did your family bring in food? I'm guessing multiple times per week, right? Who went to the dry cleaners, except for the really special clothes, the one suit you had, right? You took to the dry cleaners. You didn't routinely use the dry cleaners. We hire house cleaners for our house, right, to clean the house. That was, again, fairly unusual unless you were in particular circumstances. Think about all the nail salons, right? I can remember my mom sitting up doing her own nails. Now, right, go out to the nail salon. And of course, what's the biggest one of all that we purchase on the market? Daycare, right? We buy services buy the services of other people to take care of our kids, right? And so one of the things that happens here is as wealth begins to rise over the 20th century, it's not just that we're able, it's not just the household technology that happens. The rising wealth means we can substitute for human labor by purchasing other people's labor on the market. And what's interesting about that, of course, is that many of the tasks I'm just talking about are being done by women. The very same women who might well have been working in their households as moms, right, for no pay, right? Now we have a world in which they're able to specialize and perform some of those same services, but get paid for it. And it seems to me that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing in a whole bunch of different ways. As I've suggested, right, this predates the 60s. And one of the things that you might think about here is the degree to which the feminist movement was a result, not a cause, of increasing female labor force participation. And this is the Mad Men point, right? If you look at the world of Mad Men and look at the way those women were treated in the labor market, right, you can imagine why the feminist movement in the 60s would be attractive. And particularly, if you think about things like the feminist mystique, and there was a generation of moms who lived the Mad Men world who said, my daughters will not live this world, right? And so one of the interesting things here is to think about whether the causality doesn't run the other way. That one of the reasons we saw the feminist movement when we did was that women really were in the workforce in significant ways, and that presence in the workforce was not good, and the experiences were not good. Finally, I cannot forget arguably the most important reason why we see that twist in the late 60s and early 70s, sort of more women, even more women working, and in particular women sort of changing the way they thought about work from jobs to careers. Anyone want to guess a little piece of technology I'm talking about? The pill, thank you, yes, the pill. The pill was hugely important in sort of this story in enabling women to get into the labor force, to control, for the first time in human history, women could control their fertility without the cooperation of the man, right? It was on them to make sure that they, that they were able to do this. And the sort of increased use of the pill and its increased use by young people in particular, young women in particular, right, changes this in some really important ways. And so, we go from this world to the world of female CEOs and all these other kinds of things. So kind of as a sort of summary here, right, what's really happening with family over the course of the 20th century? Again, capitalism, wealth led to two key trends. Women's financial independence, which was part of this story that we've told here, okay? And a decline in the benefits of specialization by gender. So we were talking about this in Ross's class this morning. If you think about marriage historically, right, the idea that sort of one person would work in the market and earn the income, the other would take care of the household, right? Economists love that, right? We're specializing, and then we're going to get together and form a marriage, and we're going to exchange with each other, right? I'll bring in the income, you work in the household, right? And the benefits of marriage in that world are significant, right? You need someone to provide the other thing. And part of it is because for that period of time, men and women's human capital, their sort of skills and so on, look very different. But now we live in this world where men and women's human capital profiles are much more similar. Women graduate college at higher rates than men do, right? And so men and women look much more the same. There's not that difference between them in those ways. And so what are the benefits of marriage, the sort of more narrow material benefits of marriage? That story that economists like to tell about specialization and sort of trade within the marriage doesn't seem to work anymore, right? We both work full time in professional career jobs, right? It doesn't thinking about it that other way doesn't make sense anymore, okay? And so one of the things this might help us understand is the decline in marriage, right? Why don't people want to get married as often as they did before? Or one reason might be is that the benefits from that arrangement just aren't there, right? And I think if you ask young people, right, there's a bunch of answers to why they won't get married. One of which is, by the way, I watch my parents get divorced and I don't, right? So, but another one is like, why? What do I gain from getting married in a way that for generations before there was a perhaps more obvious answer to that. So marriage offers fewer material benefits, and the data suggests that we're seeing less of that. But what marriage does offer now that it didn't before was this much larger emotional, psychological role. And one way of thinking about what's happened, this evolution of the family that we're talking about, is that we pushed out we outsourced the economic stuff to the market. And we opened up this space within the family and within marriage to be filled by these kind of things. I mean, if you want to think about it a couple different ways, if you know Deidre McCloskey's work, right, one way to think about this is a family based on prudence became a family based on love. I also like to think about it in terms of Maslow, right? If you think about what families were about, for most of human history, they were about the things at the low end of the Maslow hierarchy, about economic security and so on. Once we begin to solve those problems, marriage, like human beings, right, can be about the higher ends, about self-fulfillment and so on. When we think about what marriage is today and why people get married, right, it's far more frequently about this sort of these emotional and psychological kinds of things. That's not to say the material things don't matter, and I'm fascinated in particular, and someone can ask me about this in the Q&A, about what marriage will look like in a world where people live to 120 or 130 years old. It's an interesting question to think about. So now it's mostly about love. Ironically, the fact that it's about love is one reason we see higher divorce rates, right? One way to think about it is now the expectation of a marriage is that it will be this deeply fulfilling sort of psychological, emotional thing. And when it doesn't live up to that, often people are more willing to bail on it than they were before. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, put aside for the moment, but just as an explanation of why people are more likely to get divorced, right? The notion that if you are not psychologically fulfilled by the relationship, right, you can get out, especially if you have no kids, right? It's easy to get out. Historically, that seems ridiculous, right? The reason you stayed married, the reason you didn't get divorced was because it wasn't about those things. It was about about the issues of economic security and so on. And you can think about this as a kind of combination of preferences and constraints. Two things have happened. The sort of bar for what constitutes an acceptable marriage has shifted, right? The couple in Fiddler on the Roof didn't care if they loved each other, right? If they had to raise a family, they had to survive, right? We're staying together. But now it's like, if you're not happy, and I don't mean to trivialize this, but if you're not happy, right, you might want out. And of course, obviously, if you're in an abusive relationship, right, you might want out as well. So the people's preferences, our notion of what we expect out of marriage has changed, but so have the constraints, right? Even if we didn't change, even if none of that changed, the fact that women in particular have much more financial independence these days enables them to get out of marriages that are perhaps abusive or again, they're deeply unhappy in. And so both the way in which capitalism and the wealth it created shifted our preferences about what marriage is and loosened the financial constraints for women, right, help us understand why we see that rise in divorce rates. And here's my, maybe depressing news. I think that this development was inevitable, and I think it's mostly irreversible. I will tell you the one piece of good news that, again, I haven't looked at the most recent data, but there does seem to be in the data a trend towards fewer but better marriages. That what we're seeing is people getting married less frequently, but if you look at cohort divorce rates have come down from where they were in the early 80s. And so again, I can say more about this in the Q&A, but I think there's reasons why people are making better matches today than they did historically. And there's some interesting sort of economics and signaling stuff that we might talk about there. So I think that's the good news. To some degree, I mean, people might argue, well, fewer marriages is a bad thing, maybe, okay, but divorce, as often as it might be a necessary evil, is still a fraught thing. Okay, so let me finish with saying a few words about the 21st century. And obviously, the most fundamental change that we're seeing in the family and have seen in the family in the 21st century is the demand for legalized same-sex marriage. Now, it's interesting. I started giving this lecture, versions of this lecture, before Obergefell and the Supreme Court decision. So my sort of language has changed over time. In fact, I've been telling this story in class context since the mid-90s, right? I was hipster same-sex marriage guy. I was ahead of my time, right? So how does capitalism play into that, right? Well, here's a few things to think about. One, capitalism gave people the possibility of surviving economically outside the family for the first time in human history. There's always been human beings who've engaged in homosexual activity. We just know that. It's true. But the notion of being gay or lesbian, of that being one's identity, and of being able to live one's life that way is a particularly 20th century phenomenon, right? And so one way to think about it is if you couldn't exist outside the family economically, there was no way to be that, to live that life. But capitalism made it possible to survive outside the family in a way that had not been the case before. We also see the development of large cities, large anonymous cities, that enabled people to live, people who gays and lesbians, say early in the mid-20th century, to live that life in some somewhat anonymity. You couldn't do it in a small town, but you could do it in the city, and that's one of the reasons why, of course, cities we think of as having, in fact, having large gay populations. Large cities, often, by the way, right, coastal cities where there's a lot of mixing of culture and oftentimes related to military stuff as well. We also see in the 20th century a sort of broader acceptance of anything that's peaceful, right? If you think about all the other changes, all the other extension of rights, all the other willingness to sort of now, we're seeing it now with the legalization of marijuana, right? Sort of this notion that, hey, what's the harm here? Who am I harming? Certainly this fit into that. Also, the separation of sex, marriage, and kids. And here we're back to the pill, right? For most of human history, right, sex was only okay within marriage, right? You got married, then you had sex, then you had kids, right? That was, at least in theory, what was supposed to happen. But now, there's no, right? There's no order anymore. You can go in any order you want, and you can get married and not have kids. You can get married and not have sex. You can sort of do this in any combination that you want, right? And if you think about if you think about heterosexual couples doing that, and how that comes across to gays and lesbians, they're like, well, wait a second. Right? If this is all crazy like this, why are we any different? Right? If it's not marriage, sex, kids anymore, and it's about love and it's about all these other things, why are we any different? Right? And when marriage changed from being an economic institution to being about love, gays and lesbians said, again, why are we any different? If what marriage means is you love someone and you want to spend the rest of your life with them, at least in theory, right? Why are we any different? And why should we be denied the same rights as others? The demand for same-sex marriage, I think, was a result of this sort of confluence of forces. And as the scholar of the family, Stephanie Kuntz, says, the real revolutionary change in the family was not the demand for same-sex marriage, but when marriage became about love. That was the revolutionary moment. And in some sense, right, again, overstatement, in some sense, everything that's happened since then, right, is a playing out of the implications, including, I think, the demand for same-sex marriage, right, crucially about this change. Once again, right, none of this is to say we don't need families. But the really, I think, profound question for the 21st century is, we need families, but is any family, any kind of family structure or family form, able to do the things we need families to do? Is it only two-parent heterosexual families that can do that? Can single-parent families do it? Can gay and lesbian parents do it? Right? So there's all kinds of interesting questions here. I know what my answer to that question is, but I think that's the question, right? Because we're not going to put the toothpaste back in the tube. The reality is we're going to continue to see this spread of different family forms. We're going to continue to see the role of same-sex marriage, right? I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, but you might be wondering about what we might call plural marriage, which is the greater than two marriage. How is that going to play into this, right? Those things aren't going to go away. The question really is, how do we make sure that everyone can do this sufficiently well? And there's my boy, Freddie Hayek. I love that picture. Those sunglasses are back in style, by the way, okay? And Hayek in another place wrote the following, that the liberal position, meaning the sort of broad liberalism, classical liberalism, is based on courage and confidence, on a preparedness to let change run its course, even if we cannot predict where it will lead, right? And if we believe in those freedoms that we associate with liberalism, right, we need to be prepared to understand that allowing people economic freedom is going to allow them these social freedoms as well. It's going to allow them to construct these kinds of social arrangements in the ways that they want, all right? And one of the things that we learn here is that by sort of, again, I love thinking outsourcing here, but by outsourcing the family's economic functions to the world of the market, capitalism caused the family's intimacy to evolve from what was a repressive patriarchy into a loving and far more equal institution. And that's the good news here, right? All of this change that we're talking about has made the family a much better place than it used to be, despite all of its remaining and sometimes significant imperfections, all right? But the other question that remains is that gap, is that two sorts of worlds at once, is that problem still sneaking up on us? Can we learn to understand the importance of the family and the ways in which we need to behave in certain ways in the family and how those sorts of ways don't work when we think about the larger society? And I haven't given this talk for a little while, so I'm going to add a little coda on here. You might think about this question in the context of the revival of socialism among young people and the sort of Uncle Bernie and all the rest, okay? And sort of think about how much of that desire, the belief that socialism is good, is a longing for the security of the family, right? And again, it's not articulated that way, I think, by sort of young people and others, but it certainly seems as though that's what they perceive socialism to be. It's not workers owning the means of production and all that, though that's what it is. It is more this sort of cocoon of the welfare state that I think in their minds either substitutes for or imitates what they think families should do. And if that's the case, that raises a whole bunch of interesting questions. And with that, I will stop and happily take your questions. Thank you very much.
Do we have, there we, got to get in the right spot, I guess. Thank you, Steve. We normally do questions in the following way. We have two microphones, one on each side. We usually reserve the first few questions for students, and so students ought to be willing to raise their hands soon, and because other people will jump in and do it. Also, we will take back the microphone when you've asked your question, so you cannot continue going on and on and on and asking multiple questions. Maybe you should use your microphone.
The leftover question I had from all that is, while capitalism might have enabled kind of the modern loving family, it still seems to be that's also pointing towards a current end of it too. You know what, with the ever-rising divorce rate and increasingly too the lack of marriage itself amongst the youth, as well as of course the rise of single-parent families. Fathers running off, that kind of thing. It points to that it is still ultimately though setting an end to the family unit, not an enabler. That was only, I guess, perhaps a brief golden period for it. Yeah. That is, we're now passing by the looks.
So a couple of responses to that. We have this vision of the 1950s family, right, that we have in our heads that sort of is our image of the ideal whatever family. It's important to remember that that was a particular historical moment, right? Families before World War II and families after about 1960 do not look like that. And that was a product of a particular time. And so, but one of my favorite things to point out, right, we have those TV shows from the 50s, right, that sort of, created this image, right? Things like the Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver and so on, that sort of gave us this image of dad goes out to work, mom's at home in her pearls vacuuming, blah, 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 right? And stay-at-home mom story. Well, what's the irony here? The irony is that these actresses like Barbara Billingsley, who was playing June Cleaver, were working moms. Who was watching her kids? Well, she was busy being June Cleaver, right? And so there's even that image, right, underneath it is something else happening. But I do think, I hope the lesson here isn't that the family is somehow disappearing. I think it's more correct to say it's evolving, it's changing, it's different. People, and we can't, I think, also get caught up in the notion of family is only when there's a legal marriage and blah, blah, blah. We see lots of places where we have couples living together, raising children together. Those are still families. And there may be reasons why they've chosen not to have the legal protection of the law and so on. So I think we just have to think about families not as a sort of picture of what they look like, their structure, but a question of what they do, their function, right? And we often confuse function and form when we think about families, and we sort of say, families are what a family is, what a healthy family is, and then we describe them. We describe what they look like, but what we don't say is, what are they doing? Right? We know lots of two-parent families that are disasters, and we know lots of single-parent families that are very successful. And so we have to look at the question of how well do they function. So I don't think the family's disappearing. I think it's evolving and shifting as it always has. And I think that's the other point here, too.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So one thing that I've noticed is if you just turn on the television, you can often see a lot of families are on TV. I think I know more about Kim Kardashian and her family than probably some of my best friends. And it's interesting because it's almost like the family has become the product in a way.
Yeah, good.
But I was wondering your thoughts on
Well, one thing, I will tell you a quick story. One of the reasons the book is called Hayek's Modern Family was a deliberate play off Modern Family, right? And so the publisher thought, well, maybe if we sort of make it like, Modern Family, right, that people will buy it. Well, it didn't really work, but it worked. I mean, it still works in the context of the book, but as a marketing gambit, no, that really didn't work. Yeah, I'm not sure what. So there's two kinds of family things on TV. There's the Kardashian type stuff, right, which is sort of and there are all these shows about real life families, who are going through terrible things and doing terrible things to each other and so on. And so there's those, but there's also the TV dramas, right, where we Blackish and sort of all these kinds of things, right, and there's always been family stuff on TV, those kind of things, right? The family has always been a subject of TV shows, and even if it wasn't the family, it was often workplaces that were substitutes for family. Mary Tyler Moore, Cheers, going back years, right? So I think part of it is people are fascinated by other people's families, right? And we look at other people's families and we look at the Kardashians and we go, ugh. Right? Remember Ozzy Osbourne, right? When Ozzy and his wife, right, were also doing this same sort of thing on TV, right? And you look at it and you go, oh. And by the way, if you watch that show carefully, they were not terrible parents, right? They were weird, but they were not terrible parents. In fact, we used to show a clip in class of it's a hilarious thing with Ozzy's son, and I can't remember his name, is trying to leave the house with a knife, right? And Ozzy keeps chasing him around the house like only Ozzy can, right? Trying to take the knife away from him. You don't leave the house with a knife. And like, yeah, Ozzy, go, right? You're being a good parent. So I think people are fascinated by other people's families, right? And we look at these disaster families and we kind of go, you know what? We got problems, but we don't have those problems, right? So I think that's some of it. We're just fascinated by that, and that's why we're fascinated by dramas that involve marriage and divorce and so on. I'm not sure. I think there's anything bigger to say about that. I do think that I spent time in the hospital recently where because of a lack of options, sometimes I end up flipping channels among daytime TV. And the amount of crap on television today is just stunning, right? And the amount of, why are there so many channels that we don't, right? And so what are you going to fill it with, right? I mean, one of the things is, let's look at other people's families.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I had a question about some of the dating apps that we've seen come up recently.
Oh, the dating apps, yeah.
Yeah,
I got lots to say
I
about
was thinking that, you know, as you mentioned, apps like this are kind of outsourcing or in a way like devolving away power from once familial institutions to, you know, allowing fulfillment outside of the family. I was wondering if you see that as an evolution towards some other purpose of the family, or if you see that as drawing away from it.
Well, so look, dating apps, anything from like eHarmony to Tinder to whatever, right? So one of the things that all of these apps are transaction cost reducers, right? They just make it easier to find other people for whatever purpose you might have, right? I have a good friend who met her husband on Match.com and was a very happy marriage, right? Tinder's a little bit different. So you know, all of it's that. I think what's really happening there is not so much a substitute for sort of the family, but a substitute for the other kinds of places people historically met potential marital partners that are not, we just don't see as much anymore. The obvious one being sort of church, synagogue, mosque, right? Where that was often a place where you met prospective marriage partners, but kids don't go as often anymore, and so that becomes less important. Even the sort of bar culture is different perhaps than it used to be. For young people, work is not so much the place where people meet, and certainly in the world of Me Too and other sorts of things, in romantic relationships with people you work with are fraught with all kinds of potential problems. So what happens is we start looking for love in all the wrong places, right? in other kinds of places. And these, you know, I think also, and I'm not enough of I'm not a psychologist. I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, but I do think those also reflect challenges that young people have with intimacy and with romantic relationships. I think young people are not as skilled at dealing with the sort of nuances and complexities and communication that has to take place in a romantic relationship. It is simply easier to hook up than it is to do that. Now, again, some things I've read suggest it's coming back, sort of dating is coming back, and maybe that has to do with some of these other cultural things. But I think that's the bigger part of it, is this combination of a loss of the traditional places where people met, and in particular, even the workplace now losing its role as that, and then this sort of question about whether young people are able to handle intimate relationships as well as they used to. And again, I claim no particular expertise here. Those are just a couple thoughts based on my own observations. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a comment that you might want to respond to in regard to this young man's comment about the family. And, you know, the 50s, well, I was there.
You was there. I was just going to say, you were there.
But it wasn't all that love. The 50s was parents of the 40s remembering all the 30s and trying to raise these children.
Right.
I don't remember it as being Cleaver family type.
Right. No.
It wasn't bad, but
Right,
I don't
right.
remember that.
That's right. We wouldn't.
Shatteringly love.
Right, and we would not have had the feminine mystique, right? The whole point of the feminine mystique was that the women, these women of the 50s, you know, bridge, bruise, bowling, and right, was sort of that was a terrible life, and they were unsatisfied and unfulfilled. And the thing, we don't talk much about abusive relationships and so on, which were certainly there. And again, you think Mad Men, the women who were working were dealing with you know, Me Too guys all the time in the workplace. So yeah, I do think we've romanticized that era. But that's an interesting challenge, right? That the media portrayal, and this goes back to the media portrayal today, right? We might well have this perception, thanks to the media, that every family's screwed up and broken in all these sorts of ways, because that's what we see on TV. And so it is weirdly refreshing when we see these TV shows that actually reflect pretty functional families, right? And back to the 90s, this show had its problems, but Home Improvement, right, with Tim Allen was a really interesting show for a whole bunch of reasons. And I thought that despite his shtick, right, their relationship was a pretty realistic marriage for the time. And they were raising these boys, and they raised them pretty well. And he was Tim Allen, right, doing all these Tim Taylor, right, doing all these dumb, stupid man things. And that's a real problem, by the way. The portrayal of the incompetent husband should offend us as much as the incompetent wife, and it doesn't, right? And it drives me nuts when I see this in the media, right? The idea, oh, we're gonna leave the kids with dad tonight. Dad doesn't know what to do. He burns the food, right? No, stop it, right? We can take care of the kids, really, we can, right? But I do think that show was interesting because it was funny, but yet you look at it and go, I'd be okay if my family was like that. And there's a few of those shows out there that we might point to that look that way. So my point here is just media portrayals are powerful and not to be trusted at the same time.
So I'm wondering how you would respond to the argument of someone like Robert Putnam, who we're having come next week, who would suggest that I think he might suggest that increased individualism, and capitalism has contributed to what people call the big sort. So it's not so much that marriage is in trouble uniformly, it's just in trouble among people of lower income.
Yep.
So is capitalism just good for people who do well? And then just another quickly related question, are you equating liberalism or liberal thought and capitalism?
Okay, let me do the second one first. When I use the word liberalism, I'm thinking of the long classical liberal tradition, which includes market capitalism for free enterprise as part of it, but also includes sort of democracy and all the other things that we think about as being part of that long liberal tradition. So I equate, no, but sort of part of it, yes. So on the Putnam question, we were again talking about this morning in class, and I think that, the data, of course, he's right, okay, that divorce is a much bigger problem among the poor than among the rich. And I think while there are interesting sort of cultural and other kinds of explanations for that, I think one of the things we can't leave out, and I left it out completely from this talk, right, is the role of the welfare state in creating incentives that lead poor people to correctly believe that they will be better off not married than married. There's a ton of demographic data about marriage and how awesome marriage is. Married people are happier, they live longer lives, they have better sex lives, everything. Marriage across the board, right, on average, of course, is good for people, right? So why are we struggling with this among the poor? And I do think, one, there are multiple things happening here. We can talk about incarceration rates of African-American men, too. There's simply no good marriage partners for African-American women, but we can also talk about the incentives created by the welfare system. And you can look at this sort of visually and see that after a certain income level, boom, all your benefits drop away if you're married and you're better off staying single. And it may well be that couples are making a quite rational decision in terms of their own well-being and the well-being of their children to not get married, right? And we can tie this, and here's where I think a lot of classical liberals and libertarians don't take the next step, which is to say, and what we also need to do is we need to free up labor markets and the kinds of government interventions in labor markets that have made it very, very difficult for poor people to get work, whether it's minimum wage, occupational licensure, all these sorts of things we might talk about, right? We can't, it's giving people crutches after you break their legs, right, might be nice, but stop breaking their legs, right? So we need to think more carefully about that too, and the degree to which that marriage problem among the poor is also a problem of not having job opportunities. And well, if I'm going to go on with this too, we might talk about K-12 education as well, right? And why another argument for sort of opening up K-12 education to competition is precisely this too, right? That we've destroyed human capital among the urban population in ways that make this all difficult. So these are systematic, intertwined problems here. Putnam and Charles Murray, right, are correct in seeing it. I'm not sure that I agree with all of the things they're talking about, even though I'm happy to admit there are these sort of cultural things about marriage that are happening there too. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Uh-oh.
So going back to kind of your last point about this resurgence of socialism, well, what some of the motivation behind it might be, and what you're talking about in relation to the intimate and the anonymous, and I'm thinking, some of these functions, right? Like making a meal, you could view it purely as an economic function, but oftentimes there's an intimate function to it as well, right? You make meals for people that you care about.
Yes.
And even a bigger one, of course, is the raising of children, right? This can be an economic function. I can outsource that to somebody, but everyone will agree there's usually a very intimate function to that as well. So I guess I'm kind of just wondering about this balance of the intimate and the anonymous. Is the intimate losing ground to the anonymous the more we commodify these things in a market economy?
Perhaps to some degree, but at the same time, right, we're, as I've said before, we're rich enough to play at being poor, right? In the sense that we can afford to see cooking. I mean, it's a great example, right? Cooking as this sort of deeply meaningful thing that we do for other people. And for most of human history, you couldn't think about it that way, right? People had to get fed. If you were lucky, they got fed, right? And now we can afford, in a way, it's probably not rich at being poor, but we can afford to sort of treat these things, right, as sort of having that emotional, fraught in a good sense with emotional and intimate sorts of things. For me, sort of providing for my family, making sure that they can eat. I don't cook as much as someone else does, but and that's not because I'm bad at it, just comparative advantage. But cooking for the people you love, right? Absolutely, okay. And it's one of the things. There was this vision of the future, the Jetsons' vision of the future, right? Where how did we eat? We took a pill, right? It had all the nutrients, and sort of that efficient, right? We don't waste our time eating. We have all the nutrients in the pill. And now you look at it and go, that's the dumbest damn thing I ever saw, right? Why would I want to just take a pill when I actually have the wealth and, interestingly, the time, right? To sort of spend on fancy cookware. Look at all the cooking shows on TV. We've turned this thing into this wonderful, and it's great. I love it, right? And it does become this sort of, interestingly, as it has become more commodified, right? You can go out and eat, pay someone to do it. At the same time, it's also become, we see the contrast when we are able to take the time to cook for one another. And again, that may be a luxury of people who have the time and the wealth to do that. But there too, I think we're seeing it increasingly available. I really do think, though, that the socialism thing is this kind of displaced desire for the perceived security of the family in a really important way. And I think and I notice perceived security, right? I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which the underlying gestalt of that love for socialism just isn't true. I mean, the sort of belief somehow that if we were all like a family, these things would be, and obviously there's just bad economics all over the place. I just saw Bernie Sanders meme today where he says, cost of a childbirth today, $32,000. Cost of a childbirth under Medicare for all, $0. Cost. You keep using that word. I don't think you understand what it means. Right, so there is that here too, right? There is this sort of economic ignorance, and I have to say, as I've been teaching economics now for 32 years, right? And this is very, very frustrating. I mean, almost as frustrating as the international trade nonsense, which is even easier, should be even easier to understand. And it's sort of how have we ended up here after all the hard work good economists have done. Got time for a couple more?
This is the last question.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
All right, I'll combine 2 points you brought up earlier. What will plural marriage look like when we live to be 120?
Okay. So let me take the 120 thing first, because believe it or not, there are two different answers to those two different questions. So the 120 thing, this is pure speculation on my part, but I don't think we're biologically capable of being married to the same person for 80 years. I mean, what does that even, 90 years? What does that even mean, right? I'm just not sure we have no notion of that. What does it mean? I think what we may end up seeing is sort of, for lack of a better term, serial marriage, right? Where people maybe marry one person when they're young, they want companionship, they want to travel, they want to do all these sorts of things. Maybe that person's the one they want to have kids with, maybe not. Maybe they marry someone else to have kids with, and they raise their kids, and the kids are out of the house, and people have changed, and now you want to do something different, right? And so we might see that. And again, we kind of recoil at that and think, wow, that's not so good, right? And because we have this perception of divorce. But oftentimes the biggest problem with divorce is it's unexpected and sort of surprising. But if you thought to yourself, maybe we just both agree that this is now, we've exhausted the benefits from this relationship, if we're more narrow economic terms, right? Maybe it's different. And divorce is certainly different when there's no kids or when the kids are adults, right? It's a very different sort of thing. So, and one other point about this. I actually think the other thing we're going to see is a sort of marriage happening later. And I think that marriage, especially if we live these long lives, and those long lives are sort of at the end are often extended by medical technology, having a marital partner at the end of life is extraordinarily important for a whole bunch of reasons. And so I suspect, and maybe it won't be legal marriage, but sort of no one wants to die alone, I think. And I think that particularly if you are dealing with medical stuff, having someone there at the end is really, really important. And so I do think it would be interesting to see, and we've seen, by the way, some hints that this is happening among older folks. So again, that's just some speculation. Plural marriage, all right. So the libertarian in me says, you want to marry two other people, marry two other people, right? But a couple thoughts. First of all, if you've ever worked in a group of 3 compared to a group of 2, the coordination costs expand geometrically. I've co-taught with one other person, and I've co-taught in a team of 3. And let me tell you, co-teaching in a team of 3 is really, really difficult. 2 is much easier. There's a reason why the dyad is historically the way humans have married. It might work for some people. The other thing to keep in mind here is, historically, particularly one man and multiple wives has been horrible for women. Right, and it turns out it's horrible for society because now you have these men who are unattached, right, roaming the streets like wild, whatever. Okay, so it's really bad. Now, again, that was mostly in poor societies. Whether that's true for wealthier societies, we don't really know. And maybe it can work, maybe it wouldn't. And it's really unusual to see one woman and multiple men, but whatever, maybe. But the bottom line here is we're not ready for this yet. If you think about the same-sex marriage story, the culture always has to change before the law does. And with same-sex marriage, we just began to see a transformation in how we talked about gay and lesbian people, how, as people came out of the closet, everybody knew someone, everybody had a relative, everybody knew someone. And so when the demand for marriage came around, it wasn't this titanic, it was large shift in sort of the way it was like, okay, we're ready for this now. We're not there. We're not even close to that with plural marriage, even if we think it is an okay thing, right? We're going to have to see it play out in ways that would make us feel comfortable. In particular, the hump to get over with same-sex marriage is when people became persuaded that it was not a problem for kids. I think that was the key, right? And that's a legitimate, real question. And whether that's the hump, one of the humps we'll have to get over with plural marriage if we ever get there, is what is the effect of this on kids? Because in the end of the day, right, I think kids are the innocent players in all of this conversation we've been having today. And so thinking about what the impact on kids is important. I hesitate to predict kind of where it's going to go, but I do think the things you want to watch for are, does it become more visible and acceptable in the culture? And I still think at the end of the day, the coordination costs of 3 compared to 2 are just so high. And I just can't see it ever being anything more than a sliver of the population who would seriously want to do this, unlike same-sex marriage, which is not that. Thank you all very much. I appreciate your time and attention.